I recently had coffee with a friend, and, well, he sits on the admissions board of a prestigious medical school. It's usually a pretty stoic guy, But he seemed different this time, kind of distracted. He told me about an applicant they'd interviewed that morning. This student had a near-perfect MCAT score, a research background in oncology that, most doctoral students would envy, a total prodigy. But when the committee met to deliberate, the conversation didn't center on the student's diagnostic brilliance. Instead, they spent 45 minutes debating whether his background, and I'm quoting here, sufficiently interrogated his own inherent privileges. He told me the room felt less like a medical faculty meeting and more like a secular church. There was this intense, almost feverish focus on ideological purity. In the end, the prodigy was waitlisted, in favor of a candidate who, in my friend's words, struggled with the fundamentals of biochemistry but had perfectly mastered the political lexicon of the administration. But what struck me wasn't just his frustration, it was his resignation. He just looked at me and said, "In 10 years, one of these people is going to be performing heart surgery. I just hope the jargon helps them find the artery." And that story, as horrific as it is, really points to a much deeper structural problem that our source material identifies. The sources argue this is a scene playing out across the entire American university system. They suggest we're witnessing what they call the terminal stage of a bureaucratic coup. It's a transformation where administrative staff has reportedly grown by 165%, while people actually discovering cures and teaching students have been sidelined. We have, in effect, traded Nobel Prizes for ideological compliance. So the core question we are faced with today is, it's pretty stark. What happens when institutions, particularly those dedicated to education and innovation, stop prioritizing the pursuit of truth and start focusing instead on managing grievances? As the federal government begins an unprecedented freeze on Ivy League funding, we need to understand what happens when the very foundations of the meritocracy collapse under their own internal contradictions.
That opening story is, well, it's the perfect lens into the structural transformation of Western elite institutions that the material analyzes. Our sources overwhelmingly point to a systemic process of decay, what they describe as an administrative coup, whereby meritocratic standards are being systematically replaced by ideological loyalty and compliance.
So that's really our mission for this deep dive then.
Exactly. Our mission today is to get into the mechanisms and the consequences of that transformation. We'll be covering 3 massive intertwined areas that really define this civilizational shift.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, we have to dedicate substantial time to unpacking the dismantling of meritocracy in our elite institutions. That goes hand in hand with the administrative bloat that has driven up costs and at the same time diminished the quality of instruction.
And the second?
Second, we have to address the most serious civilizational consequences. I'm talking about the erosion of competence in high-stakes sectors like medicine, defense, engineering, the systems that absolutely rely on objective technical skill.
The ones where mistakes have real immediate consequences.
Life and death consequences. And finally, we have to examine the sociological fallout. This is the loss of traditional social anchors that has created this deep vacuum of meaning, which is then being filled by radical identity politics and the expansion of what's being defined as the therapeutic state.
So this goes way beyond just university budgets.
Oh, absolutely. This analysis speaks to the fundamental viability of our entire complex society.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with that foundational shift, the ascent and, well, the subsequent erosion of meritocracy. When we talk about meritocracy as a system, we're really talking about a specific, actually a pretty brief historical experiment, aren't we?
That's absolutely the right framing. For most of history, societies advanced people based on who they knew or what family they came from.
Right, your pedigree.
Exactly. The period from roughly the 1920s through the 1960s represented a fundamental and deliberate break from that age-old system. This was the moment where the systematic evaluation of competence, rooted purely in ability and aptitude, became the accepted norm. I mean, it was revolutionary.
And the mechanism for this shift was? It was the invention and widespread adoption of standardized objective testing, wasn't it?
That was the tool.
The Scholastic Aptitude Test, the SAT, became this major revolutionary instrument. Before the SAT, elite universities like Harvard and Yale, they recruited heavily from a very narrow demographic.
The New England prep schools.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Preparatory schools in the Northeast, where talent was often secondary to who your father was. The SAT was designed to look beyond that, to recruit talent based strictly on objective, quantifiable ability wherever it was found.
And that standardized assessment model didn't just stop with college admissions. It electrified the entire country's approach to finding talent.
It really spread everywhere.
Oh, completely. The success of the SAT spurred a major nationwide expansion of aptitude testing that permeated industry, government, the military. If you look at the timeline, it's pretty stark.
So what are we talking about?
We saw the rapid adoption of tools like the Wonderlic Personnel Test in 1936, then the Graduate Record Examination, the GRE, also in 36, then the massive Army General Classification Test in 1941, which sorted millions of draftees for World War II, and finally, the Law School Admission Test, the LSAT, in 1948.
So this was a full-throated nationwide commitment to using quantifiable, impersonal ability to find and allocate the most capable people to the most demanding jobs.
That's it. It was a sea change in how we thought about human capital.
And when you look at the results, the sources argue that this system worked. I mean, it worked spectacularly, especially when the nation faced these enormous existential challenges.
This merit-based system achieved a staggering national capacity at a speed that was previously unimaginable.
We're talking about the capacity to, electrify the entire Tennessee Valley in just a few short years.
That and the intense research effort that created the first atom bomb, the invention of the transistor, which launched the entire digital age, and ultimately, of course, the ability to land a man on the moon.
So the sources make a pretty compelling case. This merit system was the engine of American exceptionalism and that rapid escalation of state capacity.
That remarkable period really represents the high point of a functioning meritocracy. So now we have to look at the crucial shift, the first domino that fell, which marked the beginning of its systemic erosion.
And the sources pinpoint this shift as starting in the early 1970s.
Right, following the implementation and enforcement of civil rights era policies.
You're talking about the moment when employers started getting extremely nervous about using these cognitive batteries, these objective tests of ability for their own hiring and promotion.
Exactly. While some cognitive tests are technically still legal, a series of high-profile enforcement actions and anti-discrimination lawsuits created a massive chilling effect across corporate America.
The legal risk was just too high.
It was. Employers realized that the chance of a multi-million-dollar lawsuit plus the reputational damage, if a test created any kind of disproportionate demographic outcome, it was simply too great a risk to take.
So they responded in a calculated, rational way.
A rational way that proved catastrophic for the overall system. They just stopped directly testing ability.
So if they couldn't test ability directly, how did they make sure they were hiring competent people?
They pivoted. They started using the next best thing, which was a degree from a highly selective college. They essentially outsourced their competency screening to the college admissions offices.
The thinking being, if Harvard let them in and they graduated, they must be smart.
That was the premise. We can assume they possess a high level of raw ability.
That seems like a massive externalization of risk and burden, though. I mean, you're pushing the entire legal burden of defending your selection process onto the universities.
That's exactly what they did. And for the elite institutions, this shift turned the college application process into what the sources describe as a high-stakes war of all against all.
Because admission to an Ivy League school or an elite public university became the critical, non-negotiable entry point into that professional managerial class.
Right. Failing to secure that spot could relegate a talented person to a lifelong struggle for middle-class stability. The entire weight of talent allocation was suddenly pushed onto this single, increasingly dysfunctional institutional bottleneck.
And while that burden was increasing, the university itself was undergoing a radical internal transformation. This is what we're calling the university bloat. This is what created the tuition paradox.
The numbers detailing this administrative transformation they're truly shocking.
Let's hear them.
One comprehensive study covering private colleges found that between 1998 and 2008, spending on instruction, that is, teaching and core research, increased by only 22%.
Okay, 22%.
Now contrast that with spending on administration and staff support. That swelled by 36%. The money wasn't flowing to the core mission. It was flowing toward management, oversight, and compliance.
And you can see that structural shift just by looking at the staffing ratio.
Absolutely. The percentage of full-time faculty, the people delivering the core product of education and research, is shrinking. They're being replaced by more precarious, low-wage, part-time adjunct faculty.
But at the same time, the percentage of administrators who are part-time has actually fallen.
It's a total inversion. They are committing to full-time management and bureaucracy even as they deprofessionalize and casualize the actual teaching staff.
And the internal ranks of these universities are now filled with what the sources wryly call armies of functionaries.
That's the term. We're talking about vice presidents, associate VPs, provosts, vice provosts, deanlets, deanlings, all these layers of management far removed from the actual educational experience.
And these are not low-paying jobs.
Not at all. These positions command salaries that dwarf those of most professors. We see vice presidents at large state schools, like the University of Maryland, earning well over $200,000. University presidents often earning north of $1 million a year.
And this is happening at institutions that simultaneously claim they're struggling to control costs and tuition inflation.
Precisely.
So if they aren't spending it on more full-time professors, what's the official justification for this massive administrative excess? Where's all that money going?
Universities typically cite three major drivers, and they use these to justify the increased tuition.
Okay, what are they?
First is the enormous expense of maintaining and upgrading elaborate IT infrastructure. That's a constantly moving target. Second, they cite the demand for enhanced student services like mentoring, specialized counseling for learning disabilities, mental health, and general wellness.
The third.
And third, they point to the ever-increasing requirements for compliance with federal and state regulations, which demands large teams of lawyers and administrators.
But the reality is that the financial decision was made to invest heavily in management, compliance, and amenities, rather than substantially expanding teaching and research capacity.
It was a choice. A clear one.
This brings us squarely to the economic distortion at the heart of this crisis. The tuition paradox, and specifically, the Bennett hypothesis.
The Bennett hypothesis, yeah. It basically posits that federal student aid, and this includes everything, loans, grants, tax credits, it only encourages colleges and universities to inflate their tuition prices.
It's a classic example of subsidized demand meeting inelastic supply.
Exactly. Because the student is receiving outside help, they're less sensitive to the price increase. In essence, every subsidy Washington throws at the higher education system gets immediately capitalized into the tuition. The student consumer is completely disconnected from the true economic cost of what they're buying.
And the result of this disconnection is truly shocking runaway pricing.
It is. Since 1980, the inflation-adjusted tuition at public universities has tripled, and at private universities, it has more than doubled.
And when you look at the price increases compared to everything else in the American economy,
it's staggering. Only cigarettes and other tobacco products have seen faster price increases than the cost of going to college. It's even outpaced the famously skyrocketing costs of medical care.
That puts education costs in a completely different category of economic distortion.
It does, and this paradox is deepened when you examine the sheer financial power of these institutions. I mean, you're not just talking about small, struggling liberal arts schools here.
No, we're talking about massive endowments.
Massive. The sources detail that we have 143 colleges and universities sitting on endowments larger than $500 million. And a staggering 74 schools boast endowments over $1 billion.
And a lot of those are public institutions, too.
A full 1/3 of those billion-dollar endowments belong to public institutions. We're talking about massive state systems like the universities of Michigan, Texas, and Florida. This issue completely transcends the private-public divide.
So if they command this immense wealth, we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars, why isn't that wealth being used to decrease tuition or defray the student costs they claim are so difficult to manage?
Because the central function of these university treasuries has shifted. Their focus is now less on affordability and more on amassing and growing wealth. They often act like specialized hedge funds.
So instead of using the endowments to lower the cost of attendance?
They're busy investing these billions in complicated, illiquid, long-term experimental assets. They prioritize the growth of their immense balance sheets and institutional longevity, often over accountability to the current generation of students.
It's a clear choice. Wealth accumulation for institutional status over direct cost reduction for students.
That's the bottom line.
That sets the stage perfectly for our second section, the ideological overhaul. As universities became more bureaucratic, wealthier, and less focused on pure teaching and research, the criteria for selecting who gets in and who gets hired for both students and staff began to fundamentally change.
Right. The traditional merit standard clashed head-on with a new political imperative.
And that political imperative, which has been analyzed as now being dominant in virtually all major U.S. organizations, is that diversity must be prioritized.
Even if that priority comes at a measurable, observable price in competency and institutional efficiency.
And the underlying philosophical premise that supports this view is strikingly simple, yet is powerfully enforced.
It's the bedrock assumption. The premise is that since all demographic groups are fundamentally identical in talent, ability, and intelligence, then any selection process that is genuinely unbiased must, by definition, produce group proportions that match the general population.
Exactly. The necessary conclusion, therefore, is that any observed disproportionate outcome must be evidence of deep systemic bias. It creates an unchallengeable ideological feedback loop.
And once that premise is accepted, it spreads like wildfire through the professional managerial class.
Correct. Once this view is summarized, validated, and published in prestigious journals like the Harvard Business Review, and then it flows down through influential mass media outlets like Bloomberg Businessweek, and finally it's codified as corporate best practice by firms like McKinsey.
It becomes nearly impossible for any institution to challenge that underlying assumption openly.
To do so risks being labeled biased or discriminatory. It's career suicide. What's interesting is that this pressure to adopt diversity metrics isn't coming from a single decree from the top. The sources identify multiple independent power centers pushing these policies internally, each with its own motivation.
That's a crucial detail. You have high-level forces like CEOs pushing diversity policies primarily to please board members and increase their own status in the wider cultural and business sphere. It's a status play.
Okay, so you have the CEOs. Who else?
Then you have human resources professionals. They are often focused primarily on the legal aspects, pushing policies to avoid massive anti-discrimination lawsuits and expensive enforcement actions from the EEOC.
So they're managing legal risk.
Right. Then, moving outward, you have business development teams joining in to win contracts from diversity-sensitive clients, particularly government agencies and large corporations with supply chain mandates.
And finally, the grassroots level.
Finally, you have the powerful grassroots-level employee resource groups, or ERGs. They mobilize internally, like the Black Google Network, to advocate vigorously for their specific in-group in hiring and promotion decisions. All these forces align to prioritize the same outcome, even if their motivations are entirely different.
This overwhelming internal pressure creates an escalating strategy for implementation, which the sources break down into three distinct tactics: ask, tell, and make. Can you walk us through that first phase, ask? What does that look like on the ground?
The ask phase focuses on eliminating perceived bias through measures that sound entirely reasonable and objective on the surface.
Like what?
This includes adopting slating guidelines, which mandate that every hiring process must include a certain minimum number or type of diverse candidates for every single job opening.
And structured interviews.
And structured interviews requiring interviewers to stick rigidly to a pre-approved script to minimize the chance of discovering personal commonalities with the interviewee that might introduce subtle, non-diverse bias.
But the real power isn't in the structure of the interview itself, is it? It's in the leverage that human resources gains over the whole hiring process.
Absolutely. HR evolves into the primary gatekeeper. They often directly ask the hiring manager to defend their choice not to hire a diverse candidate who is slated for the position.
And managers understand that the wrong answer could lead to institutional shaming, loss of advancement, or even termination.
So they become persuaded or, effectively coerced to prioritize diversity over the objective metrics of competence. The question shifts from who is best for the job to how do I justify not hiring the diverse candidate?
So if the ask tactics aren't achieving the desired demographic targets quickly enough, the next step is tell. This is where management starts attaching measurable carrots and sticks to the outcome.
This is the critical juncture. This is where the goals of diversity and competence enter true, observable, and disruptive friction. The primary tool here is the implementation of diversity key performance indicators, or KPIs, for all managers.
So hard metrics used to punish leaders and teams that fail to meet specific diversity targets for hiring or promotion.
Exactly. And because of the natural hierarchy of most major organizations, that pyramidal structure, the implementation of aggressive KPIs creates a massive internal morale problem that affects the majority group.
You mean systemic demoralization?
That's the term. In many large legacy corporations, senior leadership is statistically less diverse, with white men often making up 80% or more of the top teams.
So when an aggressive organization-wide KPI is imposed,
it sends an unmistakable, though entirely unsaid, message down to the layer of white men in middle management. Your chances of promotion within this organization are now severely limited, regardless of your performance.
And they figure this out as they're continually passed over for less competent, more diverse colleagues.
And the result is a demoralization and departure of high performers. I mean, why would someone put in maximum effort if they know their career path has an invisible ideological ceiling? They either coast or they leave, which is a systemic, preventable talent drain.
And finally, when even KPIs and soft pressure aren't enough to meet the targets, we get to the make tactic. Simply holding different groups to explicitly different standards.
This is direct, overt preference. We've seen this explicitly documented in academia. The famous Students for Fair Admissions lawsuit against Harvard, for example.
They used Harvard's own data.
Exactly. They successfully leveraged internal institutional data to demonstrate the precise extent to which the university systematically penalized Asian and white applicants on subjective scores to benefit Black and Hispanic applicants, all to achieve their desired demographic results.
These practices aren't just limited to explicit race-based admissions that are subject to legal challenge.
Not at all. In states like California, where Proposition 209 forbids formal affirmative action based on race, the UC system uses tools like comprehensive admission to achieve the same proportional goals through other legally permissible means.
Like prioritizing socioeconomic background or subjective personal narratives.
Right. And we also saw MIT offering jobs to previously rejected female candidates just to increase their gender diversity on staff. It demonstrates that ideological goals often supersede the previous purely merit-based hiring decisions.
The sources suggest that this commitment to demographic representation above all else means that institutional standards have to slip.
They absolutely must. When the goal is proportionality and representation, rather than pure competence, universities are compelled to admit or hire individuals who would not have met the standards of the previous era.
And no one supporting their policies is seriously arguing that these new processes produce higher quality students or faculty.
No, the sole demonstrable outcome is more diverse faculty. We've even seen anecdotal evidence of professors exaggerating or fabricating minor fractions of their ancestry to align with the ideological preferences of the institution. It just highlights the absurdity of the current incentive structure.
So if direct preference doesn't work, the last subtle step is the outright direct exclusion of non-diverse candidates.
This is done with institutional opacity. Managers are often instructed, sometimes tacitly, to sequester resumes from non-diverse candidates, typically white males, which are then simply discarded or never move forward.
And the candidates just get a polite, generic rejection email. Other candidates were a better fit.
Right. And while anti-discrimination laws exist, filing a reverse discrimination lawsuit is incredibly difficult to prove. And for anyone in the professional managerial class, initiating discrimination proceedings against their employer for favoring diversity is widely viewed as a professional death sentence.
This process of prioritizing diversity often necessitates the dilution of required competency standards. You can see this clearly in high-stakes industries like finance or tech.
Let's take the example of a quantitative hedge fund. Their ideal entry-level candidate might be an experienced former investment banker who graduated top of their class from a top-tier MBA program.
That pedigree ensures a high minimum bar for both competence and work ethic.
But it severely winnows the field of underrepresented candidates. So to relax requirements for diversity's sake, the firm might be pressured to first strip the prerequisite work experience, then offer the roles to MBA interns, and finally, hire fresh undergraduates into that analyst role.
That dilution is costly because fewer data points about the candidate means a wider range of possible outcomes. You're dramatically increasing the risk of a disastrous hire.
And bad hires who are brought in specifically to meet diversity targets are often even more costly than typical bad hires.
Why is that?
Because of the heightened legal risk of a wrongful termination lawsuit. Firms frequently draw out the termination process or adjust by simply giving them harmless busy work or roles far below their pay grade until they leave of their own volition. The organization is forced to absorb this massive ongoing cost rather than risking litigation.
And this erosion fundamentally affects the people who do perform well, the high performers who stay.
Absolutely. Morale and competency decline systemically across the whole organization. High performers want to be on high-performing teams. When they see demonstrably better candidates passed over, or they witness the average quality of their team degrade due to these policies, they respond negatively.
There was a study on this, right?
Yeah. A study noted that white male senior leaders reduced their engagement following the appointment of a minority CEO. And while some might cynically interpret this as resentment, a more plausible explanation is that high performers perceived the organization shifting toward prioritizing political statements over honest performance.
And they responded logically by pulling back their discretionary effort.
Exactly. Why go the extra mile for an organization that won't reward you for it?
This brings us to Section 3, where the rubber meets the road. The price of incompetence and the observable failure of complex systems. When competence declines in simple work, say making a chair, the product is just lower quality or more expensive.
But in interconnected complex systems, declining competency leads to catastrophic large-scale failure. This is where the academic and ideological debates become life and death realities.
These complex systems are characterized by intricate interlocking dependencies.
And the sources point to the 2021 Texas cold weather system failure as a textbook example. A seemingly straightforward environmental event, a rapid temperature drop, caused unwinterized natural gas power plants to shut down.
And that single failure just rippled through the entire system.
Through the energy grids, infrastructure, and ultimately the water systems, resulting in 246 completely preventable deaths.
The systems theorists would describe this as formally stable, tightly coupled systems beginning to experience normal accidents at a rate faster than the system can possibly adapt or compensate.
And that prognosis is chillingly clear. The sources argue that we face a critical choice. Either the focus on selecting for competence returns quickly, or America faces the devolution to more primitive forms of civilization and the loss of geopolitical power.
Because our civilization is an inheritor of these incredibly complex, interconnected mechanisms that we just assume will work.
The electric grid, air traffic control, medical supply chains. The most worrying shortcoming of systems theory in this context is that it often takes high-level human competence as a given. The U.S. is now running a novel social experiment. What happens when the men and women who built and maintained these critical systems are systematically replaced by people chosen for ideological reasons rather than ability?
And we are seeing that decline, starting at the very core of our concentric system, the federal government, and working its way outwards.
The sources suggest that since that peak era of the 1960s, the time of the Manhattan Project and the space race, the state capacity of the federal government has been declining almost monotonically.
And those foundational steel girders that supported the competency of government agencies were the first parts of the American system exposed to the salt water of civil rights era policies,
which shifted evaluation metrics away from pure ability. This steady human capital decline in government agencies is a tremendous danger, especially in safety-critical sectors.
Like the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA. We've had a phenomenal air safety record in the U.S. since the 1970s, but the sources indicate that record is beginning to fray significantly.
The evidence is mounting that the tight coupling of the air travel system is stressed. The first 3 months of 2023 alone saw 9 near-miss incidents at U.S. airports,
including at least 2 reported cases where planes came within 100 feet of collision.
Which is terrifying. This uptick resulted in the FAA and the National Transportation Safety Board convening high-profile safety summits. However, the underlying root cause identified in the sources, the systematic decline in competency and focus on non-technical metrics during hiring and promotion, is the one issue the leadership seems least likely to address openly.
The same competency crisis is clearly affecting the U.S. military, an institution defined fundamentally by the need for objective readiness and performance under pressure.
Given the military's size and reliance on complex high-technology systems, it's not surprising the diversity push has directly impacted readiness.
Let's talk about the Navy.
Consider the Navy. Following 3 entirely avoidable collisions of U.S. warships in 2017, the USS Fitzgerald and the USS John S. McCain, and then the massive avoidable fire in 2020 that led to the $750 million total loss of the USS Bonhomme Richard.
After all that, investigators interviewed 77 current and retired Navy officers, And what did those interviews reveal?
They revealed a consistent theme: the prioritization of diversity training and ideological compliance over fundamental warfighting preparedness. Things like core skills in ship handling, navigation, and firefighting protocols. The focus had visibly shifted from technical mastery to achieving non-military social goals.
And the response from the Navy leadership, instead of addressing these competence failures, was deeply revealing about their priorities.
It was startling. Instead of mandating a return to rigorous technical training, the Navy commissioned Task Force 1 Navy. And this task force actually recommended de-emphasizing or outright eliminating meritocratic tests, like the officer aptitude rating, specifically to boost diversity targets and meet proportionality goals.
It was an explicit choice to lower the bar further.
An explicit choice. Many officers openly admitted that given the current operational issues and training deficits, the U.S. would likely lose an open, sustained naval engagement with a near-peer competitor like China. It really underscores the massive civilizational stakes here.
So we've covered the government core and the military. How does this ideological push manifest in the outer ring, starting with institutions that receive government funds but aren't strictly governmental, like nonprofits and universities?
The next class is nonprofits, which includes universities, large charities, and think tanks. They are affected by two primary factors.
What are they?
First, they are subject to government diversity rules because they rely heavily on federal grants and tax-exempt status. And crucially, they lack a bottom-line, market-driven profit motive.
Without the external discipline of the profit motive, the internal incentives change entirely.
They absolutely shift. Decision-making moves away from what maximizes efficiency or quality and instead gravitates toward what maximizes the status of the individuals within those organizations.
And advocacy for diversity is a high-status position.
A very high-status position. Therefore, the cost of incompetent staffers in a nonprofit is absorbed by the amorphous body of stakeholders. The public, the student body, the beneficiaries, rather than any specific individual bearing the financial cost of that hiring decision. This creates an environment where ideological compliance is the safest and highest status choice.
Now let's move out to the business world, specifically publicly traded corporations. They still have a profit motive, but they face immense external pressure to comply with the same standards.
Publicly traded companies are the biggest targets for Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC, actions and multi-million-dollar discrimination lawsuits. This is why HR has evolved from simple onboarding oversight to acting as a regulatory and political gatekeeper for every aspect of hiring, promotion, and firing.
They manage the firm's compliance risk, not just its human capital.
Exactly. And the subtle reason for their compliance goes back to the capital markets, which provides the ultimate external pressure.
How so?
Publicly traded companies rely on ongoing relationships with a spider web of powerful institutions. Banks, credit ratings agencies, proxy advisory services, massive institutional investors. Losing access to capital or having your credit rating downgraded because of a political scandal is an immediate death sentence for the CEO's career.
So CEOs rationally choose to push diversity policies.
They prefer a small, predictable drag on their profit margins over a potentially career-ending scandal or an activist investor campaign triggered by pushing back against the prevailing ideological wind. Compliance becomes a cost of doing business.
Finally, we get to privately held businesses. Do they follow the same trend, or are they insulated?
They vary tremendously based on the views and priorities of their owners. High-status partnerships like the Big Four accounting firms or top-tier management consultancies often cut standards to meet diversity targets.
Because they have to maintain their high social and professional status.
Right. However, they manage this risk by hiring for diversity, but then often placing those hires into non-core roles, say internal HR or compliance, where they are the least likely to damage the firm's core brand or service delivery.
That's a fascinating risk management maneuver. Hire for optics, deploy for minimal damage.
It is. But here's the counterintuitive exception. The sources note that firms founded by diverse individuals are often the most highly meritocratic. Their focus on making money, the fundamental requirement of private enterprise, shields them from some of the external criticism.
Because their diverse founder status provides cover.
Exactly. They are less susceptible to the political pressures faced by their publicly traded counterparts or status-driven consultancies. Now we shift from the organizational costs of the competence crisis to the profound sociological consequences. When traditional mechanisms for selection and advancement collapse, and organizations prioritize performance second to ideological compliance, it creates widespread social anomie, a deep lack of social cohesion and meaning.
This concept of anomie, first popularized by the sociologist Emile Durkheim, is now evolving to describe modern chaos driven by this institutional vacuum.
Our source material suggests two developmental variants of social anomie operating simultaneously in modern society: normal anomie and reflexive anomie.
Okay, what's normal anomie?
Normal anomie suggests that what might have been considered a deviation from old norms, such as institutional selection based on identity over ability, is simply becoming the new, stable normal in the emerging social system.
And the second type, reflexive anomie.
Reflexive anomie is more subjective, chaotic, and harder to predict. It results from a nonlinear reaction of individuals to external, often random and meaningless influences, forcing decision-making down to the micro-world level of the individual.
So it's basically an individual struggling to make sense of a world that lacks unified, understandable rules for success.
That's it. This transformation is driven by accelerating mobility, the deliberate weakening of traditional social anchors like the family or local groups, and the increasing reliance on one's own individual ability to reflect, adapt, and invent meaning. When the rules for success are constantly shifting based on political wins rather than objective reality, internal order and cohesion rapidly dissipate.
And the most extreme manifestations of this social chaos are often seen in these seemingly inexplicable acts of mass violence, like the actions of Breivik in Norway or Paddock in Las Vegas.
In these cases, and others like them, the intensive investigations establish no significant, clear external social determinants for the extreme actions. No immediate poverty, no long-term unemployment.
And no confirmed mental illness either.
Right. Breivik, for example, was declared legally sane and liable. Paddock's autopsy showed no brain abnormality. The actions were disconnected from traditional sociological causes, suggesting deeper, harder to diagnose social determinants are being overlooked.
So when these deep systemic social determinants are overlooked, the popular response tends to be personalizing the problem, finding a flaw in the individual, not the system.
Yes. It is much easier for experts in the media to spot mental deficiencies than to admit to a profound sociological failure. The most popular post-factum explanation in scientific discourse and mass media for destructive antisocial behavior has become the narcissistic personality disorder, specifically malignant narcissism.
A diagnosis that's practically asymptomatic until after a destructive act has already occurred.
Which effectively personalizes the problem it was a sick person, rather than addressing the deeper social anomie and vacuum of meaning that might be driving individuals to such extremes.
And as the social anchors collapse and meaning erodes, the state eagerly steps in to fill that vacuum, resulting in the rise and expansion of what is called the therapeutic state.
The state's expansion is perpetually nurtured by successive crises and health emergencies, while sometimes underplayed in political theory, absolutely belong on top of that list.
So despite claims that the state is in retreat, the overwhelming evidence confirms the government is getting dramatically bigger.
Bigger, not smaller, leveraging these crises as justification. And a key tool in this expansion is the politicization of medicine itself.
How so?
The sources trace a clear evolution. Historically, pathologists and researchers defined disease. Today, politicians and their appointed lackeys, like surgeons general, define disease, and the term treatment is often used as a euphemism for coercion. This allows the state to reframe its expansion and its controls as necessary public health care.
The public expenditure illustrates this growth dramatically, particularly in healthcare.
The sheer scale of this financial mobilization is immense. Between 1960 and 1998, public expenditure on healthcare per capita increased over 100 times, from 35 times to $3,633.
That's exponential growth.
Exponential. And look at the war on drugs. It costs $19 billion today. To put that in perspective, the entire federal budget in 1941, before the U.S. even entered World War II, was $13.6 billion. The state's involvement in defining and managing health provides the justification for vast resource mobilization and social control.
And this expansion of control often takes the explicit form of coercion disguised as care, redefining social deviance or distress as a medical illness.
We see the explicit medicalization of psychological trauma routinely. Following events like school attacks or plane crashes, classmates or relatives are instantly converted into patient fodder for forcibly imposed grief counselors.
So what was once considered ugly meddling is now accepted as medical care.
Exactly. Concepts like PTSD are routinely imputed to people, especially children, who are then rendered helpless to reject the label or the subsequent treatment plan.
This expansion, accepted under the guise of care, has led directly to a tangible loss of personal autonomy.
That is the ultimate consequence. When the American people invited the state to manage their health, to declare a war on social problems, they effectively surrendered control, not only over the health care they receive, but also over other aspects of their lives.
And the ultimate legal expression of this is often seen in the court system, where treatment is mandated.
Absolutely. Consider drug courts, which use explicit coercive powers to push nonviolent drug offenders into treatment. Defendants are under duress to accept treatment, which often requires them to plead guilty. The therapists involved still maintain that accepting treatment is ultimately voluntary.
Even though the choice is between treatment and a long jail sentence.
It's a coerced choice. And shockingly, even if a defendant is found not guilty of the original offense, treatment may still be continued if deemed necessary by court-appointed professionals. And if they relapse, they face immediate jail time with stiffer sentences.
And the threat to liberty is profound here, because the language of freedom is being repurposed.
It is. When the state equates health with freedom, the concept that a healthy society is a free society, liberty, as a purely political concept, vanishes entirely.
The state frames its actions as waging necessary wars against diseases, drugs, and social problems, turning citizens into metaphorical soldiers who must comply.
Which allows the state to justify controls and intrusions that would be unthinkable under the traditional banner of political governance or individual rights.
Moving into our final section, let's look at the financial costs of these systemic failures, particularly in education, and analyze the flawed policy solutions that have only exacerbated the problem.
Right. Let's revisit the massive price tag of college. U.S. Senate testimony on education tax incentives detailed that federal support generally falls into three massive categories. Incentives for current expenditures, like the American Opportunity Tax Credit, incentives for student loans, and incentives for savings, like 529 plans.
And the policy arguments for these subsidies are clear. College costs are a barrier, and education produces positive externalities for society.
But the reality, according to the sources, is that the counter-argument is stronger. It directly reaffirms the Bennett hypothesis. Washington's constant influx of money, the subsidies, grants, tax credits, only incentivizes colleges to deliver bigger bills.
They're just chasing the inflation they're creating.
Exactly. As long as institutions know that students have federal money in their pockets, they can boost costs without facing the normal backlash you'd see in an efficient, price-sensitive marketplace.
The financial practices of universities, beyond just tuition, demonstrate their true priorities, especially with their vast tax advantages.
These tax advantages are enormous. They amount to an estimated $10 billion annually in foregone tax revenue for the federal government. This includes billions in research dollars, tax-free bonds, tax-free donations, real estate, sports revenues, and crucially, tax-free endowments.
The use of tax-exempt debt is particularly revealing about how universities prioritize institutional wealth over student affordability.
This is where we see the phenomenon of tax arbitrage. The Congressional Budget Office studied this and found that institutions hold investment assets significantly higher in value than their outstanding tax-exempt bonds.
So they're taking advantage of the government subsidy.
They are. Nearly 100% of the tax-exempt bonds issued by colleges are classified as earning profits from tax arbitrage, compared to only 64% for nonprofit hospitals.
So they are prioritizing the growth of their immense endowment portfolio rather than liquidating those high-performing assets to pay for capital projects.
Precisely. The tax-free status of the debt makes it financially irrational for the universities to sell high-yielding endowment assets. The strategy is clear. Borrow cheaply via tax-exempt bonds, let the massive endowment continue compounding tax-free, and therefore prioritize institutional balance sheet growth over direct student affordability.
This means the money is absolutely there. It's just locked up in investment vehicles. What policy solutions were proposed to address this?
The most prominent proposal was to require colleges to do what private foundations must: spend a certain percentage, typically suggested at 5% of their endowment value every year. This would unleash billions that could be spent on decreasing the cost of college.
And beyond the university's financial shell games, the tax code itself, as a tool for social engineering, seems inherently flawed.
It creates enormous complexity that undermines its effectiveness. The intention of tax-based aid was to lower the net cost of enrollment. However, studies show that the institutional price response substantially counteracts the intended savings.
This is the price discrimination Bennett hypothesis.
Right. Institutions often strategically reduce their own institutional grant aid to appropriate the benefit of the federal aid without technically raising the sticker price.
And the complexity simply creates a massive barrier for the very families it's intended to help.
It does. The IRS publication explaining education tax incentives is 87 pages long. The FAFS has 100 questions. This immense complexity means that many low and middle-income families, lacking access to tax professionals, fail to choose the credit that benefits them the most, or fail to complete the application correctly. They leave billions on the table.
So the core conclusion here is that the tax code violates sound principles of tax policy simplicity and neutrality by introducing immense complexity and distortions.
Moreover, the extensive use of tax credits has warped the entire tax landscape. Today, some 41% of all tax filers have no income tax liability due to the proliferation of credits and deductions.
So 58 million Americans have been effectively taken off the tax rolls since 1940.
Right. And despite the stated goal of helping low-income families, education tax benefits often accrue disproportionately to high-income taxpayers. Roughly 30% of the credit benefits go to those earning over $100,000. It is an inefficient, complex, and poorly targeted way to address a problem driven by a lack of market competition and unchecked administrative bloat.
We've covered a vast and complex landscape today. We've synthesized the systemic shift away from meritocracy, driven by administrative bloat, enormous financial wealth, and a new ideological priority. And this is leading to a palpable, real-world erosion of competence in safety-critical systems like aviation and defense.
And this is all happening while a society struggling with lost meaning is increasingly managed by the therapeutic state through medicalized coercion and the redefinition of liberty.
The central question posed in our initial material remains the most critical one.
What happens when the people who built and are currently managing the complex systems our society relies on, systems that created the highest standard of living in human history, are systematically replaced by individuals chosen for reasons other than objective technical competency?
The biggest challenge we face is no longer innovation or expansion, but simply the maintenance of what we already have.
And this is particularly urgent as the baby boomer generation exits the workforce, taking with them decades of irreplaceable, non-codified tacit knowledge. Institutional preferences have attenuated meritocratic evaluation at every single level of American society.
The discussion on competence and ideological loyalty reveals that the highest costs are not just financial, but civilizational. The pursuit of justice through non-meritocratic means may paradoxically exacerbate social inequality itself. The growing gaps in educational attainment translate directly into a widening economic opportunity gap, threatening to devolve our democratic society into a rigid caste society, where the children of poor are destined to low education and menial work, while the privileged compete for status and ideological compliance in bloated administrative ranks.